very much, James, for the very nice presentation and introduction. Indeed, I'm Razvan Venter, and I'm very happy to start this session, which I hope will be very nice and which will lead to a lot of questions and useful discussions in the end. I will talk to you about a way of addressing cybersecurity risks, especially, of course, in the IoT domain by means of standards and certification. And I will start with a bit of introduction about myself, followed by some description of what we currently see in terms of evolution and threats associated with IoT. We're not going to spend that much time on that because it's information that most of us know anyway. Then we're going to go really into the more important topics of presentation by having a bit of a discussion on who should be the drivers, who should really promote and enforce security in the world of IoT. We're going to introduce the importance of standards, and we're going to spend a couple of slides checking the state of the art, and we're going to do that by checking several individual IoT verticals and referencing the relevant regulations and standards in each of them. And finally, the last part of the presentation will be dedicated to the topics of compliance and certification and what kind of issues can we encounter when we see those kind of, when we apply compliance and certification across the whole supply chain. So to get started, this is me. I have more than 5 years experience in IT security, and my focus since the beginning when I joined this domain has been in the world of compliance and certification. I worked across several domains such as healthcare, medical devices, industrial systems, consumer products, as well as payments and financial domain. Currently, I work as a security specialist for security and certification specialist for Secura, which is a Dutch security assessment and compliance company. And the world of IoT is definitely one of our main topics. What we currently see in this domain is that the activities are pretty much following a cycle, and there are several parts of this cycle. Of course, there are new trends, which are mostly driven by new features and functionality, leading to the development of new products or services. That's on the upside. And then on the other hand, we have more or advanced security threats that are leading to security impacts on those new products and services. So I'm not going to spend that much time actually on providing those kind of very nice figures and numbers about where we are with IoT security per domain, which I'm sure that you saw many times at very many other conferences, and probably some other speakers will have those on their slides as well anyway. But to just summarize this first part of the presentation, IoT really is everywhere. If a couple of years ago you would tell someone about IoT, then probably they would think about consumer devices, right? That's how it all started. But right now it's really a big part of our lives. It's everywhere. It's in our smart cars. It's in our medical devices, in industrial systems, so industrial automation, really everywhere. And the increase rate is actually quite remarkable. It's faster than ever. On the other hand, threats are actually not staying on their single spot, but they're also actively being developed and actively being increased. And that comes as a matter of fact that new and improved products and services are actually having a lot more features and functionalities, and that brings us to many more possible threats that we can explore. But also, those kind of products are more and more interconnected, so the avenues of possible attacks are getting wider. And it's not only theoretical, because very often and very constant, we see those kind of threats being successfully exploited in practice. And we see so many publications addressing successful attacks on IoT products and services. So basically, when we see all of those issues in practice, a question that we all continuously ask ourselves is, can we afford to ignore security? And of course, the answer to this question is quite trivial. Of course, we should not afford to ignore security. And what we see in practice is that most of the people that we work with, most of the manufacturers and people involved in the IoT domain are noticing and are aware of the fact that ignoring security will lead them to really big risks from a cybersecurity point of view. However, we seem to be currently stuck in this circle or triangle of pointing fingers towards who should be really driving the security initiatives, who should be promoting cybersecurity. And the main actors, the main parties within that circle would be the manufacturers of products and services, of course, the end users, but also the government, so the regulators. So let's think a bit for a moment who should really drive security, because that's a really important question, and which will then result into the discussion of how can we make standards and frameworks more adopted in practice. If you consider from a consumer, from an end user point of view, especially on the consumer side, end users are very often not that aware of the risks. And even if they would be more aware of the risks, currently they're still more driven by nice and interesting new features. So they're not willing at this point to invest more, to spend more on a product that is more secure. On the other hand, the regulators, of course, everyone looks at them because they have the power to issue new laws and legislations. And there are definitely some successful initiatives already in the field. For example, the world of payments is quite well regulated, and that seems to work fine for a big number of years. However, in other domains, like consumer or industry or smart cars, there are some initiatives which are being currently worked out, but those initiatives take a lot of time to develop, and even after they will be developed, they will take quite some years in order to be properly enforced into the field. So by considering those things, what we believe at this point is that the highest responsibility should be at this point in the hands or on the shoulders of the manufacturers. Of course, there's no black and white. It's going to be definitely a shared responsibility. Users should also enforce, and government, of course, we definitely expect a lot from their side. But currently, at this moment in time, the ones in this circle that have the biggest power to drive progress in cybersecurity are manufacturers. But then, of course, there's the question how to start from your manufacturing point of view. And here's where we believe that standards are a strong tool for approaching security. Of course, standards have, especially internationally recognized standards, have a couple of very relevant characteristics, very important characteristics. They have validated technical content, both in terms of security controls, which should be promoted and should be applied in practice, but also on the more software side of security, like a process or procedures, which are to be implemented. But at the same time, they have two other important elements that personally I find very relevant within the field of IoT, and that is the fact that they provide a common language and a common set of objectives that are to be shared by the stakeholders involved in a domain. For example, in our case, in the domain of IoT. And considering the fact that the domain of IoT is so complex and with so many parties involved, well, having a common language and a common set of objectives is simply crucial in order for us to approach security from a correct and efficient point of view. And this is why we believe that standards are really an important step in starting to address security and in improving trust into your products and services. I promised a bit of state of the art, and the way in which I'm going to try to do this is by focusing on several, to be more precise, 4 verticals of IoT, and for each of them describing the most relevant regulations that we currently see in the field, as well as the most relevant standards. So starting with the domain of automotive, smart cars. From a regulations point of view, currently we don't see that many in practice. Of course, now I'm referring to security, because from a functional side there are quite several. From a security point of view, there is an initiative currently being discussed in Europe, driven by UNICE. Probably it's going to take still a couple of years until this initiative is being successfully adopted in practice. But on the other hand, there are some internationally relevant standards which should be of reference for smart cars manufacturers in designing their products. On a more procedural point of view, so development framework, there is the ISO 21434, currently under development, and which should go live somewhere next year. And from a security controls and technical features point of view, we have publications which are issued by both American and European entities, such as the American Department of Transportation or the European ENISA. In the world of industrial control systems, again, we don't really see that many regulations. However, that's actually a bit interesting, because this is a domain quite well covered by standards, and here I would like to mention specifically the IEC 62443 family of standards that was actually initially designed for the world of industrial control systems, and as we'll see later, is quite applicable for other domains as well. We also have the UL 2900 family, especially a part of it is really applicable for ICS SCADA domains. And also on the more procedural and process part, we have the NIST 853 framework. In In the world of consumer IoT, well, here is where, especially the first version of the IoT Security Foundation framework shined, together with some other relevant publications. Again, we see the IEC 62443 and UL 2900. Those are standards which are really addressing connected products, so which could be quite well mapped to the needs and risks of consumer products. And at the same time, another framework issued by GSMA, specifically addressing consumer end products. And from a perspective of the regulations, again, there's mostly none. Quite recently, there was this regulation adopted in California, published in California. It's going to be enforced in 2020, but to be honest, it's not yet that mature, and honestly, it just addresses pretty much 2 requirements, and those are mostly only about secure passwords. So we're far from being quite strong on that. And finally, I left the domain of medical devices till the end, because honestly, from those 4 verticals, this is the most mature in terms of regulations. It's covered in both the American and European markets by regulations. In America, driven by the FDA, and in Europe under the medical device regulation. And both of those regulations are considering cybersecurity specifically as part of their requirements. And talking about standards, there are some relevant publications that could be used by manufacturers while designing security into their products. IEC 6443 and UL 2900 are specifically recognized by both FDA and the MDR as being validated standards. And that's on the technical, procedural part. And more on the process side, we have ISO 14971 addressing risk management in medical devices, or ISO 62304 addressing secure software development. So to summarize on this, we have sufficient publications. The bottom line is that all of those verticals are quite well covered by standards. We don't need to create yet another standard. It's just a matter of adopting one or maybe more of those available standards or frameworks and putting them in practice in order to improve trust into our products. And talking about trust, here's what I like to call the chain of trust, and it has several stages. Honestly, I wanted to add another stage before those 4, and that would be no adoption at all, where unfortunately currently in the world of IoT, we're mostly are right now, especially in consumer or industrial or smart cars domain. On top of that, there's the claim of following a standard, and that's actually an important step which we fully support, because at least it shows that you're aware that some standards are relevant. On top of a simple claim, in order to increase trust, there's, of course, the matter of compliance, which pretty much asks you to demonstrate, maybe via some technical report or self-assessment, that you are following correctly the requirements of a standard. And following from that, of course, there's certification, which is in many cases performed by an independent organization, even third party. And that actually issues you a certificate, so a stamp on your product, that indeed it is compliant with all the applicable requirements of a particular standard. Finally, the last stage that we can think of is a harmonized certification, and especially in the new context of the European Cybersecurity Act, those harmonized certifications at European EU level will be developed in the next upcoming years under the supervision of ENISA. We talked a lot about trust and security, and especially security requirements so far. And I would like to dedicate the last part of the presentation towards a bit of a different topic, which is especially relevant in the context of compliance and certification. And that's more about assurance. So besides simply going through a checklist and seeing requirements, how satisfied are we with the assurance that we get as a result of this process? And that's actually very important in context of certification. And I'm going to do that by actually taking a practical example, so focusing on end products. That's why I put this example of a camera here, but it can be really any consumer end product. And what we have to realize, and what we actually see from our position of a company that actually works a lot in the security assessment of those consumer things, is that a consumer product like a smart camera is actually just a set of software applications and external interfaces and ports and any other components put together into a single system, which is running on top of a very large software platform, which is running on top of one or many low-level hardware ICs, processors, secure processors, or whatever you want to call them. What's happening is that in many cases, all of those 3 elements are actually being designed and manufactured by different companies, which don't really talk that much to each other. They don't share that much information. So what's going to happen is that, let's take now an example of a commercially available framework. So let's take the IoT Security Foundation framework. And I think the discussion is quite relevant because, as we heard just before lunch, they are working on establishing their own certification scheme. So it's something that we should take into account. What's going to happen is that, especially the first version of the framework was focused on end products. So if you start doing your assessment on top level of this stack, so really by addressing end products, you can end up with a relatively low level of assurance. And why is that? Well, simply because what we also see from our own experience, the manufacturers of those products will be able to answer and support you in your testing for many of the requirements in the framework. But for other requirements which are purely implemented in hardware or in software, which is completely out of their control, they will simply answer with, yes, we know or we think that's being fulfilled because that's what we read in the datasheet. And we really don't have any more information on top of that because the chip manufacturer is not sharing that with us, is their IP. So, of course, that's a very interesting topic, and I'm quite sure we can discuss a lot more about that maybe in the final panel. But what we can say about this, and actually this is not entirely those are not entirely our ideas, but there are things that several other people in the field have been expressing as well, is that in order to implement correct security certification or even compliance scheme, we should first of all think about addressing with our framework all the parts of the supply chain. We should address both end products, both software developers, and of course the chip manufacturers. And also from a depth of assessment point of view, our belief is that it should really start from the root of trust, which is currently implemented starting from the ICs, which are implementing features like random number generator, secure boot, and so on. Go quite deep in those products and ask the correct questions to the correct people. So in those cases, to the chip manufacturers, and then slowly go upwards and leverage the results that we established in the first place all the way up to the manufacturers of the end products. So in conclusion, to wrap up, there were a couple of things that I wanted to highlight that I talked about over the presentation. The fact that, in our view, at this point in time, cybersecurity needs to be driven mostly by manufacturers. We believe that standards are a very important first step in approaching security from a manufacturer's point of view. We went through the whole chain of trust, and certification is definitely a solution for increasing and demonstrating trust into your products. And what we currently believe is that an efficient security certification scheme should address at least equally the whole supply chain that goes into the manufacturing of a product or a service. And I think that we're going to keep the questions to the last part of the session. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention.